Great. So everybody, welcome. I'm going to start as the last few people are going to be trickling in, and we also have a lot of people online. So good morning, and I think I don't know all of you anymore since people changed. So I'm Sherry Spiegel, and in my last job, I was the chief of the policy analysis branch that led the work on the Interagency Task Force and the Financing for Sustainable Development report, though since July, I've been the acting director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office. And Oliver Schwank, who is here, is taking over as the lead of the IATF and the Interagency Task Force, along with all the colleagues, many of who are here, with Peter Chawla, Pauline, I saw you someplace, and Rodrigo, and some other colleagues who are not in the room right now. But you will be seeing as the year goes forward, and we move into the process of working on the report. And as you all know, that the report, for those of you who are somewhat new and don't know, the report comes out of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. There was a request for the Secretary General to put together a task force of the entire system who work on financing issues, to together put forward a report on the 7 chapters of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for member states. The financing for development process always had, going back to 2002 in Monterey, it had 5 institutional stakeholders, major institutional stakeholders, which were the IMF, the World Bank, WTO, UNCTAD, and UNDP. And in Addis, the call was to maintain those 5. So you see them here today with us, and UNDP and WTO are on the screen. And then, but to really reach out to the entire system and bring everyone together. So we now work with more than 60 agencies on this report every year, mostly UN agencies, but also some non-UN agencies. The OECD Secretariat contributes to the chapters on tax and development cooperation. The South Center contributes across the board to balance the North and South perspectives. The Financial Stability Board contributes to the chapter on systemic issues, as well as other non-UN entities, and then every UN agency you can imagine contributes in their areas. And it works very well, even though it sounds like it can be very challenging, because we bring everybody together into clusters and groups to really focus on the issues that they're experts in. So that's the report that we're working on now, and this is every year. For those of you who are new, we have 1 to 2 informal dialogues to discuss where we are in the process and to share what we're thinking with member states and to get feedback and thoughts from you. This is the first one, and it's very early in the process, so we're just starting. But nonetheless, it's become perhaps one of the years where this is even more on the agenda and more in the highlight in the limelight than in past years. As you know, financing questions have become central to the UN agenda and to implementation of the SDGs. Financing for development took center stage at the SDG Summit, and there was enormous interest in the high-level dialogue. And as you know, of course, you are all negotiating the issues of a 2025 conference to follow up on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and Monterey Consensus and Doha Declaration. As highlighted in the SDG stimulus, and as you all know, we are also off track to meet the SDGs. Only 15% of the SDGs are on track. So financing issues are really center stage of thinking about how do we get the SDGs back on track. And then, as highlighted in all of the reports we've been doing, and certainly since 2022, we've really highlighted what we call a great finance divide, where there are really big, where developing countries have, and since the start of COVID, or even before COVID, but since the start of COVID, the challenges of countries to be able to raise affordable financing have really been highlighted and exacerbated. And for many reasons, including the global economic issues, the tight global financial conditions that have really exacerbated for everybody raising the cost of capital, but particularly the credit spread on top of the cost of capital goes up at the same time, so that developing countries are hit particularly hard. But we've also had a sluggish global economy with decelerating growth, growing needs, financing needs, and multiple shocks that have set back sustainable development. At the same time, I think that there are and there has been important reforms that are happening in the international system, and certainly discussion of those reforms. So we are in a place where things are being discussed across the board in every single chapter, in tax issues, in debt issues, in private finance issues in terms of aligning private finance with sustainable development. There is really action happening across almost every single action area. But I think that at the same time, there's an understanding that those actions just aren't enough to meet the growing needs, so that the needs are growing faster than the international community is able to respond. So I think we have to understand, we have to really look at where are the steps that are happening that are positive, but why are we still so far off from where we need to be? The global context is extremely challenging due to both the recent shocks, but also due to longer-term trends, which of course are linked with the recent shocks. So many of the recent shocks are tied to the global trends that have been happening. And these have been highlighted in the past editions of the Financing for Sustainable Development report, and they're also highlighted in this year's Secretary General report on FFD. But certainly rising systemic risks and the impact, particularly climate change. Digitalization has had enormous benefits, but has also led to risks and changes in the global economy and the way finance works, meaning that our institutions are not necessarily set up to deal with these changes that are happening. And certainly, as I said, there are global macroeconomic trends, the tightening financial conditions, which are happening after a period of very low interest rates. And so that's always a period of enormous financial risk when suddenly interest rates rise. There's been increased leverage, increased borrowing across the board, and then when refinancing costs go up, it leads to real either defaults or to crises. And so we talk a lot about the sovereign debt issues, but it's not just a sovereign debt problem. It's a problem across the board in financial markets where there are too much leverage in certain places, and what happens when interest rates rise. And then, of course, as I said, there's low global growth that the IMF really highlighted at the recent annual meetings, but that particularly it's variable across countries and regions. So that some countries and regions are being hit particularly hard in terms of the low growth scenarios. Another trend that we've been talking about for years is rising inequality, which has eroded trust in the social contract, which has led to, and in addition to that, there is rising geopolitical tension and risk of geoeconomic fragmentation, just at a time when global cooperation is probably more important than ever. The fourth conference would be a major opportunity for the international community to come together to agree on policy solutions that are going to be both ambitious and politically feasible. So the Interagency Task Force in the upcoming 2020-24 report will aim to advise member states from the ideas and thoughts from the entire system in line with the mandate that was received last year in the conclusions and recommendations of the 2023 FFD Forum, where member states requested, and I have to read this, the task force to present an assessment on progress made in the implementation of the Monterey Consensus, of the International Conference on Financing for Development, the Doha Declaration on Financing for Development, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, identifying obstacles and constraints encountered in the achievement of the goals and objectives agreed therein, with a view to informing an inclusive, informal dialogue on all issues related to a potential fourth international conference on financing for development. So, this mandate differs from previous years in two important ways. First, it expands the time horizon of analysis, which had in prior years primarily focused on recent trends and developments related to the Addis Agenda and sometimes just to the most recent year because we've been doing the report every year. So now, and the second would be that it explicitly links the 2024 FSDR to preparations for a potential fourth international conference on FFD in 2025. In this light, we are suggesting three new elements in the 2024 report. First, instead of an opening thematic chapter, usually, as you know, we have a thematic chapter where we look at cross-cutting issues that seem very relevant. But instead of highlighting a thematic chapter, we're actually going to use this year's thematic chapter as a deeper, substantive introduction to summarize the ideas in all of the chapters and pull them together to really highlight the key issues that may be most interesting and relevant to member states, including questions to think through for a potential conference. Second, we propose to adopt a longer-term timescale for analysis, looking at trends and relevant policy developments since 2000 That's just a round number. So since 2002 with the Monterey Consensus, but since 2000. And as I noted at the beginning, talking about some of these really big trends, the world has changed dramatically since 2000. So some of the climate, and even since 2015. So climate risks were already there in 2015. And you see these in the development of the changes from the Monterey Consensus to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Climate risks and systemic risks, some of these big risks are more in Addis than they were in Monterey, but they are even bigger than everybody suspected or thought of in 2015, even in the past 8 years. The same with digitalization. There have been big changes there as well. So that and of course, the crises that we've seen in the past few years have changed the way that we're all thinking about some of these issues and really exposed some of the gaps in how the international system is and is not able to respond when crises happen. So we are in a very different world, and we're going to try to look back all the way to 2000. And we'll have less emphasis unnecessarily on what just happened in the past few years, but really a bigger picture of where these big trends are, how these trends have changed the way that, and what they mean for financing for sustainable development. And third, we suggest focusing recommendations on the questions and challenges that member states that you could address in a fourth conference. So that's my basic introduction for where we are. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your perspectives on how the task force can best support member states in the run-up to FFD4 and in the run-up to the negotiations in the FFD conference this year. The financing for the ECOSOC Financing for Development Conference, Financing for Development ECOSOC Forum, thank you. And we're going to start with interventions from the 5 major institutional stakeholders, and then I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague Oliver to moderate the rest of the session. So first, I'm going to pass the floor to my right to Robert Parrell from the IMF, who's a special representative of the IMF to the UN. Thanks, Robert. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Shari, and good morning, everyone. As Shari says, I'm the IMF special representative here in New York. If you're looking for an example of good collaboration across the UN system, this is one of them. This is my 5th cycle, would you believe, Shari? And I've worked very closely with Shari and Oliver and Peter over that time, and this is really one of the areas where the UN system, especially on the economic side, works very well together, and some of the reports that we've put out have been really, really very good. And collaboration is obviously critical. In 2015, the UN and its partners, we gathered in Addis to create a framework for financing for sustainable development to support the SDGs. And since then, the world has grown more prone to shocks, making sustainable development much more challenging. Countries are grappling with food insecurity, climate change, geoeconomic fragmentation, not to mention all the conflicts. Policy space is constrained due to tightening global financial conditions, persistent inflation, and elevated debt levels. The emerging markets and the developing economies need additional financing to overcome these challenges. And recent work in the IMF indicates that low-income countries need $440 billion just through 2026 in order to resume and accelerate their income convergence with advanced economies. According to our latest estimates on SDG costing, and we do a lot of work on SDG costing, SDG-related spending needs for emerging markets and low-income countries have risen recently for obvious reasons. We've kind of gone backwards a little bit. On average, emerging markets now face costs of about 4.8% of GDP, of the 2023 GDP. That's up since 2019, and low-income countries face costs of, on average, about 16% of GDP. So in this very difficult context where financing is clearly the biggest challenge, the IMF is supportive of the proposed approach that Shari was talking about to drafting the 2024 FSDR, and in particular, the suggestion to take a longer-term perspective of trends in the various core chapters of the report and what lessons we've learned over the past couple of decades. And I think this analysis could indeed be extremely helpful to inform the discussions by our common membership at the 4th Financing for Development Conference planned for 2025. As usual, The IMF will contribute within our areas of expertise, and in particular, we would plan to focus on the planned chapters on debt, on public finance, and systemic issues, such as the global financial safety net, where, of course, there are a lot of policy evolution going on. It's critical, I think, that the agencies represented, both the big five, if you like, but all the others work closely together, focused on our areas of expertise to help increase financing for sustainable development. Our initial thinking, and it's very much our initial thinking, is that some of the themes that will need to come through would need to include, first, that countries need to act decisively to increase their own resources. This is a clear message that came through both at UNGA but also at the recent annual meetings. We must help countries lower debt burdens that are crowding out financing for the SDGs. I think we all know that one. While I think the risk of a systemic wave of sovereign debt defaults in emerging market and developing countries is actually low, debt vulnerabilities do remain high, and for a handful of countries in debt distress, improving the debt restructuring process is going to be vital, so we'll need to talk about the progress made there. Financing for sustainable development will require innovation and coordination among not only country authorities, the IFIs, multilateral development banks, the private sector, and donors. Coordination is going to be critical. Public-private synergies, I think, are also very important. Blended finance, for example, can help de-risk investments and crowd in private sector finance through mechanisms that see the public sector providing first loss capital, for example, equity or credit enhancements. I think it's important to scale up financing, such as the MDB's Capital Adequacy Frameworks Review and the World Bank's Evolution Roadmap, and I think those are welcome steps and consistent to some degree with the SG's push for higher financing. And of course, we'll make sure that the report reflects well the ways in which the IMF in particular is supporting this whole process in its three pillars of activity. That's lending, surveillance, and of course, importantly, capacity development as well. Maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think if I can, just to, that Robert's comments showed both areas where there's enormous agreement across all the institutions, and then areas where we still we're going to figure out where we land. And I think one of the ones is the debt issue. So, but I think for several years now, we've constantly talked about what's the debt narrative. And I think we all are in agreement that the debt crisis is a development crisis and is a sustainable development crisis. There may be differences as to, what these risks are, how systemic it is for financial markets and questions like that. Though I think on that the idea that it's not systemic to financial markets, I think we also all agree on. But then what systemic means, maybe sometimes there's differences in how we define that. But I think we look for where we can analytically pull ourselves together and where we all agree, and how do we come up with a narrative that works within this discussion. And so part of our discussions has been talking about the sustainable development crisis of this and how we can articulate that well and show the data to back that up. But I'm going to pass the floor now to Audrey Leonis from the World Bank. So she is the World Bank New York, yeah. Audrey, over to you.
So yes, hi, thanks so much for inviting me here today. I'm the bank's focal point on the IATF. And I want to echo Robert. I also wanted to put an emphasis on the unbelievably constructive and collaborative process that is the FSDR every year. And risk of being politically incorrect, my favorite. I'll be very brief, and I am looking forward to in particular, the 20-year analysis that this report is going to undertake. Robert covered the needs very well, and we don't need to go into it, but you'll have heard our new president, Ajay Banga, say that urgency is needed. We have embarked on an evolution process with the goal of, among other things, being able to scale up financing for those who need it most by leveraging our own balance sheet and mobilizing additional financing. So far, and with the help of donors, we have found ways to boost lending capacity by $157 billion over the next decade. We're continuing to look at ways to better use callable capital and SDRs. As you know, we just completed our annual meeting in Marrakesh, and Ajay recently said to staff that we should view this moment as a turning point, which makes this FSDR, I think, particularly important for us. Some of the outcomes, new vision and mission, a world free of poverty on a livable planet. We launched hybrid capital and portfolio guarantees, with several countries announcing contributions. We announced expansion of our Livable Planet Fund to incentivize global public goods, and we laid out operational model reforms. One thing that was very significant is you may have seen a joint statement across MDBs coming out of Marrakesh. This is not the first such, but this president has definitely demonstrated a real commitment to stepped up collaboration across MDBs, and you'll see greater standardization of processes and an emphasis on co-financing. And we made clear that there's a need for a bigger bank and a capital increase. So next step is the IDA replenishment process, which starts next month. Midterm review meetings in early December will start this, and the year-long process will include any policy changes. And everything will conclude in December 2024. The bank is already taking measures to bolster crisis financing to IDA countries through a new crisis response window plus with a target size of $6 billion. The amount will be announced at the midterm review meetings. The bank is counting on all its partners to help make IDA 21 the most successful replenishment yet. Since 1960, IDA has provided $533 billion to 115 countries. Annual commitments have increased steadily and averaged $36 billion over the last 3 years. 2/3 of overall IDA funding goes to African countries. And so in terms of the report, I think our focus is going to be on international development cooperation, and we'll be engaged in all of the chapters, but that one and then the overview in particular, and where else is needed.
Great, thank you, Audrey, and also really appreciate the collaboration with both of you and also with you. So over now to the next institutional stakeholder. So from UNCTAD, and it's Juan Jose Badillo, who's now the chief of the UNCTAD New York office, and most of you probably know already.
Thanks, Shari. Just let me start by thanking you and the FSDO colleagues for organizing this. I think it's a very timely discussion that as we start with preparations of the next FSDR. I have my role here today basically will be to contribute UNCTAD's perspective as one of the 5 major institutional stakeholders. I think there's a couple of reports that we have issued this year that sort of provide interconnection of issues that are relevant to the next FSDR. So with your indulgence, I will just go briefly through those main contributions as sort of the emerging trends that we see for the 2024 FSDR. Now, in terms of the report itself, the next report, we intend to continue contributing data and analysis on FDI, helping highlight the global economic context, and in particular, we thought that we could better support the data monitoring and follow-up setup. We have a separate statistical service now, separate, independent from the substantive division, so we have perhaps more elements that we can contribute there. And of course, we will continue to be part of the gender cluster, and which helps with the gender mainstreaming as part of the Interagency Task Force. But as usual, there's, as others have said, there's areas where the contribution is perhaps most intensive. And in our case, those would be the 3 chapters: international trade as an engine for development, science, technology, and innovation, and debt sustainability. So I will focus those issues that I said I would share on those 3 chapters particularly. Now, starting with trade, UNCTAD and WTO are the leading contributors for this chapter, international trade as an engine for development. And we know that under the right condition, trade has lifted millions out of poverty, have fostered economic growth, mobilized levels of finance, and helped build virtuous cycles in debt, in investment, and so on. But we see emerging trends that are likely to shape trade in the coming years. And some of those trends are the growing interface of trade with decarbonization and with digitalization, and the emergence of fragmentation trends that were mentioned before. And all of these trends could yield mixed results. Now, the reconfiguration of global supply chain is ongoing, so we don't know what that will yield, but the likelihood is that it will result in a fragmented landscape. Now, at the same time, the trade architecture that we have is not adapted to a context in which all economic powers do industrial policy at the same time. This will pose problems in the long run, particularly for small and medium-sized countries. I think the IMF, in fact, has raised the estimates that a world full of trade decoupling would result in a 5% hit to global GDP. 7%, okay, sorry. Latest number, 7% hit to global GDP, which is more than the economic, actually more than double the economic damage caused by the pandemic. The growth of trade in 2023 is not going to be as strong as was originally anticipated, and particularly the growth in global trade in goods and services is lagging further behind. To illustrate this, in UNCTAD we expect trade to grow at around 1% this year, while GDP is growing by 2.4% this year. So, by contrast, the so-called hyperglobalization era had a rate of growth of trade about double the rate of growth of GDP. So that shows that in the current scenario, then trade is no longer, not currently, that engine for growth that used to be the case. And looking at the numbers more specifically, we see that trade in goods is actually in decline, and trade in services, in particular, driven by the services related to the global economy, is that driver behind the overall growth in trade. Then turning to STI, science, technology, and innovation, then that's maybe the more defining engine for growth and development, because we are in an era of rapid technological change. So that ability of countries to keep up with that technological progress is one of the defining factors in growth and development. Nevertheless, we see slow technology diffusion, both within and across countries, which is increasingly being recognized as one of the major factors behind the stagnation of productivity growth. Technology also underpins, of course, the capacity of countries to address complex and pressing challenges like decarbonization and food security. Yet, even within developed countries, there is a growing gap in technology adoption and use between what we call frontier firms and the rest of the economy. So frontier firms usually lead the technology adoption and they leverage the cutting-edge technology to enhance productivity, and the rest of the economy, particularly MSMEs, tend to lag behind. Within developed and developing countries, this gap is of course larger. Developing countries face numerous challenges in adopting new technology, including infrastructural, skill-related, and regulatory constraints. The fear is that yet another revolution in production will leave economies of developing countries even further behind. And as a result, what we see is innovation that is increasingly concentrated geographically. We estimate that the investment gap, and this is a number that we have quoted in the past, this is from the World Investment Report, to be around $4 trillion per year, investment for the SDGs. And of that, about 1.7 trillion in renewable energy investments. In that same World Investment Report, we also have the numbers that show that 30 developing countries have not registered any large international investment project in renewables. So that makes that one of the key mechanisms in which developed countries are supposed to get the technology, which is investment, just remains an elusive prospect. Looking forward, what we see is that we should not only facilitate the access to new technologies, but also support the capacity of the economies and business to integrate and harness these technologies. But as was said before, perhaps the most pressing development challenge that we see today is debt. And one figure that we used in the World of Debt report is that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payment to service debt than on either education or health. And this number highlights two issues. One is that, as was said before, the term debt crisis is perhaps not appropriate. Rather, we're talking about a development crisis. And a development crisis is more severe and serious than it is a debt crisis, because the long-term implications of debt crowding out social spending are clear. And that's even before we consider climate change and SDG costs. The second point that comes from this number is that the current debt challenges can only be understood when we put them in the context of present and future needs, and not in the context of past initiatives. So framing, for instance, the current debt issue by the lens of the HIPIC initiative can be misleading, because when we use a HIPIC lens, as opposed to an SDG lens, that forces us to focus on the financial sustainability of debts judged by the continued service. So we then focus on metrics such as arrears accumulation, distress levels, and so on, while we should rather be looking at the opportunity cost. So focuses on the means future development and rising political stability that servicing these debts at any cost would imply. So the question is, in 10 years from now, the debt might be repaid, but at what cost in terms of unmet development priorities? So this is where the kind of reasoning that we try to get to in analyzing the debt situation. This is why using the SDG lens to assess debt sustainability is important, because a society can be in distress much before their debts are in distress. That, of course, coming back to that 3.3 billion number, which is what we used to illustrate this. So in this slide is that we see our contribution to the debt and debt sustainability chapter. Just to conclude, we see a global economy at a crossroads. The attainment of the SDGs, that has been said, 15% of the SDGs, it's fading. We see slow export growth, transfer fragmentation, widening technology gap, and a combination of high interest rate, weakened currencies, and crushing debt burdens, squeezing the fiscal space of developing countries. So we look forward to continue to contribute to the report and to work with the 5 institutional stakeholders, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Jose, and thanks to your colleagues in Geneva, who we work with very closely on all of these issues. And really, I think the point on debt is really also indicates how integrated these different chapters are with each other, because we're trying to look at debt not just about when a country goes into a crisis, but when countries have a big debt overhang that stops them from being able to invest in the SDGs. And we need solutions in both cases. And that's very linked to all the different chapters of raising domestic resources, how, et cetera, so that these chapters end up being very, very linked. And sometimes it's challenging for us to separate them, but that's the framework. And we have to separate them somewhere or other. So anyway, I will go now to the next institutional stakeholder on the screen, Sir George Molina from UNDP, the chief economist from UNDP. George, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sherry and colleagues. It's delighted to join you. We fully endorse the good work done by the Interagency Finance Task Force and the proposed deeper substantive introductory chapter that Sherry just described, as well as taking that longer-term view, that 20-year period analysis in preparation for the 4th Finance for Development Conference. We know that in the short run, the global economic outlook is reeling from geopolitical tensions, with potential effects on oil, commodity, food prices, as well as the higher for longer horizon for interest rates in advanced economies, which have ripple effects over developing economies. And I think that's been mentioned by Sherry and by Robert as well. The debt issue will definitely stay on the radar for many debt vulnerable economies throughout 2024 and 2025. However, I'd like to make just 2 quick points on the FSDR. First, we think it's very important for the next report to emphasize this 360 view of development financing that's captured by the Addis Ababa agenda. A lot of the recent G7, G20 discussions have tended to focus on MDB reform, and we highlighted that in the SDG stimulus proposal made jointly with UNCTAD and DESA. And we believe MDB reform discussion is important, but it does not exhaust the discussion about development finance, which includes an important role for domestic resource mobilization and the political economy of that, and the inequality, both redistributed between countries and within countries, but also capturing capital flows and private capital flows, as suggested by many, including the G20 Summer Singh report presented earlier this summer that we think is an important input into the global discussion. The second issue is that we think the time is ripe to think about how both development and climate financing are intertwined as we move towards green and just transitions at scale, both for the metrics aspect, because there are accounts that are overlapping for both streams, but also for the way that climate financing is delivered, which is often scattered and fragmented in relatively small funding vehicles with various formulas for access. In the future, we hope that more development and climate financing can be allocated on the basis of vulnerability and need, and less on the basis of GDP per capita. We think that the intersection between development and climate financing will be critical to achieve the twin goals of growing, creating jobs and incomes, but also decarbonizing and incentivizing circular economies. And we've seen this from the first movers, like the EU's New Green Deal, the US's IRA, and the China Low Carbon and Circular Economy Strategy, which are showing us a template. And basically, they're saying we can do both things. We can grow, create jobs and income, but also decarbonize. We think that message needs to have a ripple effect to developing and emerging economies, because that's the right way of looking at it for all of us. We are sure that this report will pave the way for a fruitful discussion at 4th Financing for Development Conference. So back to you, Sherry. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thanks for bringing up the climate/development discussion. You know, we find that there's often a lot of confusion out there on the interlinkages, where there's overlap and where there are differences, and how do we understand both of those cases. And so the task force, and maybe even an FFD4, could be a place to put clarity onto some of those issues. So with that, finally, sorry. So, but it's something that will take time. So there's a conference coming up as well. And the next speaker from the 5 major institutional stakeholders, also on the screen from Geneva, is Raul Torres from WTO, who also has been working with the task force for many years. Probably since the beginning, Raul, you've been contributing. So over to you. Thanks.
Absolutely. That's correct. So it bears repeating that this is an excellent example of interagency collaboration, and I every year look forward to doing this work, because it brings to the fore some very interesting issues that affect the question of multilateral system and the multilateral cooperation overall. And in this sense, I think we very much welcome the focus that is being given to the FSDR 2024, because the issues that it proposes to analyze very much align with the latest research analytical work that we've been doing in the WTO. And these center on the challenges that we find to multilateral cooperation. And these challenges have been brought about by recent crises that we have been facing, commonly referred as the poly crisis, but this is the consequence of the effects that we've had from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and its consequent rising food prices and threats to food security, etc., that have gendered a narrative where trade and multilateral cooperation is a problem, because it contributes to resilience and does not foster inclusivity and sustainability. And that's why we see a lot of policymakers move away from globalizing policies, rather towards more isolation and economic independence type of policies, which present a risk for the advancement of many of the goals that the multilateral community has set. We've heard from different speakers, and Sherry in her introduction, about the rise of geopolitical fragmentation and trade policy tensions, and effectively we have seen that play out in the context of international trade, where we see that this fragmentation has led to trade growing within geopolitical blocs, but decreasing among geopolitical blocs. So if you divide countries along the lines of how they are voting in the UN, you'll see that the trade has been decreasing between those geopolitical blocs that we have seen lately in the UN, and this is really affecting also trade flows from all countries, and there is a growing sensitivity to trade between blocs that are distantly geopolitically. So, but we also have seen some positive effects coming from trade, and is the the role that it played in the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the adaptation to the war in Ukraine by the multilateral system, trading system, fostering the ability of countries to rapidly change sourcing to different countries that were being less affected from the war. We've also seen a rise in digitally delivered services and an importance of e-commerce that will be examined in the FSDR as well. And we do think that progressing in these areas has the potential to continue to deliver on economic growth and poverty reduction, as well as on inclusivity, because we see that it integrates better MISMEs, women, as well as what we see that this will be effects also from growing trade liberalization in agriculture that could lead to more inclusiveness among countries and also within countries. And these issues will be very much at the center of the discussions during MC13 or 13th Ministerial Conference, which will take place in February, which will coincide pretty much with the time when we will issue the report. So we hopefully will be able to capture some of the outcomes of the conference in the FSDR. As I said, one of the other elements that was brought forward by George from the UNDP is this complex relationship between the work that is being done on the environment and climate change and the different economic activities, and particularly that of trade, where yes, evidently trade contributes to emissions, but overall we see that the welfare benefits of trade do outweigh the environmental costs. And we also see how open trade can be a force multiplier for coordinated climate policies, and that's an important element that we need to be looking at this in a more holistic manner. What is the impact of climate change on trade? What is the impact of trade on climate finance, etc.? So I think that those are issues that we will be looking at in the FSDR. And finally, I think that from the FSDR and as the messages that should be driven forward in the fourth Global Conference on Financing for Development is that to address the challenges that we have in the world at the moment, we need more cooperation and we need to increase the financing towards sustainable development to close that gap that Sherry was referring to. And because global issues transcend borders and therefore they require international cooperation. And we're also seeing how the spillovers from domestic policies are much larger than they used to be, so that the effect, many more countries across the globe, their effects are not limited to a singular economy. And therefore, a stronger multilateral system and stronger multilateral cooperation is crucial for resilience, inclusivity, and sustainability. So we've seen that it's very difficult, and we have experienced that in the WTO and in our 12th Ministerial Conference. It's very difficult to reach agreements when you have so many diverse actors, but it's clear that cooperative solutions do remain possible.
Thank you so much. And it's also clear that agreements are needed more than ever. So So I'm going to now pass the floor. Thanks to all of you, and just to say how, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit less closely working directly with everybody, but still working with everybody, all the different stakeholders, and what a pleasure it's been to really have this wonderful collaboration between all the institutions. And I'm going to pass the floor to Oliver to moderate the session. I know some people have to leave at 11:30 for the tax negotiations. So if you can, maybe if you want to speak early, you can raise 2 hands or something so Oliver knows. Over to you, Oliver.
Great, thank you so much, Sherry. I understand that we have to get to you quickly because some of you have to leave. I just wanted to, of course, return the compliments. The colleagues are very polite, but I think it has been not only a productive but very pleasant collaboration. So returning that from our side. And just 2 very brief reflections, if you allow me, responding a bit to the suggestions from partners already. So I think that for those of you, the delegates that were involved in the negotiations for the FFD forum outcome, you've really shown your wisdom because the mandate you've given us is really very helpful and already leading to very productive discussions. So this taking a longer time horizon into account and thinking back over the whole period, I think is already leading to very interesting findings. It allows us, for example, to put the most recent shocks and the outcomes into this broader, longer-term perspective and really allows us to tease out some of the long-standing challenges, for example, in the architecture, some of the things we have not done over the last 20 years that then have caused us to be so vulnerable to this current set of shocks. Of course, it also allows us to take stock of the many positive things and the progress that have been made over this period, that we may lose sight of in the current moment of crisis. And secondly, and I think that already came out today as well, it really, when you take that perspective, it really brings out how interlinked these issues are. The issue of debt was mentioned, that how it's linked so closely to the insufficient access to concessional finance or the challenges many countries still face in mobilizing sufficient resources domestically. I think it also comes out very clearly then the links between the financing and the trade and the technology issues. The difficulties of many countries to diversify their economies, to integrate more productively in the global economy, then translate into much greater vulnerability to the current series of shocks, to volatility in commodity prices, for example. So taking that perspective, I think, will allow us to really bring out the holistic nature of this agenda. With that, and apologies for taking another minute, we are going to your questions and interventions. I think we are early enough in the process that we can also still take suggestions from you. I don't know if we can deliver on all of them, but this is a chance both for you to ask questions on the work so far, but also to tell us what you expect from this report and what, from your perspective, would be helpful as it will land in a very special moment in the spring of 24, when you will likely embark on substantively preparing a 4th conference. So the floor is open, colleagues, for questions and suggestions. Yes, maybe we'll collect a few now and try to have a first round of answers by 11:30. So, yes, Switzerland, please.
Thank you. What an honor to break the ice. And yes, I am one of those people who needs to leave a little bit earlier because we start negotiations on tax at 11:30. Thank you very much to your colleagues for these very interesting and helpful presentations. We are also looking forward to the discussions on the FSDR 2024. And as a co-chair of the group of friends of Monterrey, together with Mexico and Germany, of course, the FSDR will again be the basis of discussions of the retreat that will take place in March 2024. In my personal capacity and capacity of a representative of Switzerland, I would like to raise 2 quick points. And I would like to touch on a point that the colleague from the World Bank mentioned regarding the question related to increasing the lending capacity of the World Bank. So I myself wasn't lucky enough to travel to Marrakesh in October, but I did receive a short briefing from a colleague who was there. And my impression was, and I might be wrong about this, but that fairly few discussions took place regarding the questions related to debt sustainability of countries in debt distress and in a debt crisis. So in my understanding, increased lending to developing countries should go hand in hand with a solid analysis of developing countries' absorption capacities and additional loans, and as well as their debt situation. So I was wondering to what extent the cooperation and the coordination between the different actors of the task force has taken place regarding these questions, and also to what extent we could have a discussion on that in the report, because I think it's really important and quite crucial to link those two questions. Then the second point is regarding SDRs. So the reallocation of special drawing rights that was mentioned several times today has often been seen as sort of a low-hanging fruit for countries of the global north to support countries that are in need of additional fiscal space. And several member states from the global north have publicly committed to reallocating a part of their SDRs. However, my impression is that we have been hearing more and more about so-called technical difficulties of reallocating SDRs. And so what I was wondering is whether it would be possible for the report to include something like an overview or an update regarding the challenges of the reallocation of SDRs and possible success stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Both questions well noted. A colleague over there, please. If you can also introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. For those who don't know me, I'm Jorge Murillo from the Permanent Mission of Colombia. It is a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I thank very much the ITF for this very timely meeting. Just want to raise a couple of comments from our perspective. First of all, I think very much there's an IMF from, for bringing up the issue on the debt crisis being a sustainable development crisis. What is interesting for us is that although there is no maybe consensus on this being a systemic debt crisis, it seems to be consensus of this being a sustainable development crisis. But from our perspective, the challenge remains in translating this in the way the financial institutions approach the different needs of developing countries when it comes to mobilizing additional finance and filling the financial gap to invest in the sustainable development goals. I take the liberty to quote UNCTAD on this. Thank you very much, Juan Jose, for that. If we are looking through this lens, we should be looking not only at the debt sustainability, but also to the cost of opportunity. That means we need to broaden the scope. And for us, it seems that the international financial institutions are very focused, of course, in providing solutions, timely solutions to the distress through debt management, through different mechanisms, relief, restructuring. That's very fair, and that's very timely and needed for countries in need. But also, there is a lack of further efforts to enhance mechanisms for those developing countries that are not maybe in unsustainable scenarios, and to provide them with the tools to avoid them to be in that distress in the future. And I think this is actually a message that has been coming from the international financial institutions frequently, that we should prevent the distress scenarios. And in that sense, then, considering the cost of opportunity we have, we should be able to enhance the work and the potential and the relevance of innovative mechanisms. And here we are really convinced that there are potential in thematic bonds, there is potential in debt swaps for climate and nature, and we do believe that there is a lot more that could be done, because it is not about how to, in this case, provide solutions to debt distress scenarios, but how to unlock additional financial and fiscal space if we are really looking at this as a sustainable development crisis and not as a debt crisis solely. Just wanted also to pick up on the UNDP comments on the need to look at developing and climate finance and the way they are intertwined. We really believe that's also important, and how to inform access to that kind of finance in the future will be critical. And hopefully the FSDR could look at the potential of existing processes such as the Beyond GDP discussion we're having, and how that could inform that kind of decision making. We also thank the World Bank for a very brief update in terms of the outcomes in Marrakesh. We did hear about decisions about increasing the capital. That is very interesting for us. If we could hear a bit more in detail what was the size of that recapitalization, or how was discussed. And we also hear an alignment to work towards the protection of global public goods, which is also very important from our perspective. We'll be also interested in hearing a bit more in terms of the criteria on identifying those global public goods and specific decisions to be made by the board to make this real. Finally, just to close, and apologies for taking so long, towards the next report, it will be very interesting, and I find it interesting also that I didn't hear anything specific about that, is how the FFD4 will be able to inform the financial reform, the reform of the financial architecture, which is an ongoing broad discussion we are all having. That will be critical. There are many things on the table, and I do believe that it's going to inform the discussions in the next conference. Thank you very much, and apologies, probably I will need to leave as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I know some people already left, but perhaps we can do one more in the room. Oh, yes, please. The floor is yours.
Morning. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Mujahid Umar from the Permanent Mission of Nigeria. I am one of those new officers here, so maybe you're seeing my face for the first time. Firstly, I wish to express our sincere appreciation to the Interagency Task Force for the rigorous efforts in leading up to the forthcoming 2024 FSDR report, and for facilitating this crucial dialogue. We acknowledge the task force dedication to shedding light on the widening gap in access to affordable financing for development, a challenge that is acutely felt across the developing world. Without addressing this issue, we risk deepening a development deficit that could erode the trust and solidarity foundational to our global community. As we look forward to the anticipated urgent call to action, we underscore the importance of a transformative SDG stimulus package. We are acutely aware of the imperative to enhance long-term financing for development countries, recognizing its potential to significantly propel us toward achieving the SDGs. In the realm of international financial architecture, we emphasize the vital need for the strategic allocation of SDRs to the nations most in need. Such measures are crucial to afford these countries the fiscal capacity to overcome economic adversities and to invest in a sustainable recovery. In this context, I would like to present a question that reflects our dedication to practical and inclusive financial reforms. So, as we advance in the preparations of the report, how can we ensure the SDG stimulus package and the allocation of SDRs are effectively tailored to the unique economic realities of developing countries? What frameworks can be established to guarantee that these financial tools are responsive to the specific needs and circumstances of each country? Moreover, we recognize the critical need to enhance international tax cooperation and address the challenge of illicit financial flows. These issues are central to the economic integrity and sustainable development of our nations. As you are aware, we are actively engaged in negotiations and advocacy for a more equitable global tax system. Therefore, my second question is, in what ways can the international community amplify its efforts to reinforce tax cooperation and curb IFFs, ensuring that developing countries, especially those in Africa, retain access to their rightful financial resources? We eagerly await the insights from the dialogue and forthcoming opportunities for advancement at the SDG Summit, the high-level dialogue on FFD, and the Summit of the Future. Thank you. I also have to go too, but thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, and apologies for the clash in engagements. It's difficult to schedule this so that everybody can be there the whole time. I would suggest let's do a round of responses from our side, and then I know there are some questions also from the colleagues that are connected on the screen. So perhaps just from my side, two first reactions. I think this question around debt sustainability and absorptive capacity gets precisely at the issue we had already discussed, which is that there is not only a challenge with countries that are in a debt crisis or at the precipice of one to resolve these crises fairly and effectively, but there's, of course, also the challenge for a much larger number of countries that have very high debt levels, very high debt service burdens that crowd out investments, that crowd out SDG spending. And I think this is precisely where this question lands and precisely what we need to tackle in a report that has this ambition of being really looking holistically at the FFD agenda. So that is going to be our ambition, to think about what needs to be done, what analytical tools do we need to understand these challenges, and how can we provide financing, debt financing or other forms of financing so that countries can have the fiscal space to invest. And just to say that, of course, the systemic issues chapter will discuss, for example, SDR, both the channels that we currently have to rechannel some of these SDRs, some of the proposals that are on the table, and the technical challenges related to those proposals, for example, to rechannel SDRs through the multilateral development banks. Those are ongoing discussions, and we'll speak to them in the respective chapters. With that, any reflections from our colleagues? Robert, please.
Yeah, thanks. Three quick points in response to the people who have left already. First, on the systemic debt crisis, what do we call it? I mean, I tend to think of it as a financing crisis rather than a systemic debt crisis. That's just the way we come at it, which is maybe a narrower definition than I know others are using. On the collaboration on debt issues and the debt versus new lending issues, we work very closely with the World Bank. And obviously the IMF can never lend to a country with unsustainable debt, so we do we update the debt sustainability analysis and look at potential new lending versus what's there already on an ongoing basis, and we're constantly looking at the methodology for debt sustainability as well. And then on SDRs, there was actually good progress made on getting commitments of SDR rechanneling at the annual meetings. It's not so much reallocating the SDRs, it's members agreeing to on-lend their SDRs to two of the IMF trusts, the PRGT and the RST. But we made good progress on that. There's actually very strong demand, especially for the RST. Obviously, the PRGT is for low-income countries. The RST is pretty much for all middle-income and low-income countries. There's already been 10 approved, and there's a lot more in the pipeline. So it is getting channeled to the countries, and we're working very closely with MDBs on ways in which they can do that. And obviously, all this will be reflected. Progress will be reflected in the final papers. Thank you.
Any other reflections, Audrey?
I think there were some questions on the capital adequacy issues. And we should look into maybe how to brief members on some of that. Ajay referred to it in Marrakesh as creative financial engineering, but it's essentially about squeezing the balance sheet. So it was initially an adjustment of the loan to equity ratio, portfolio guarantee mechanisms, hybrid capital instruments, boost lending capacity. Germany made an initial contribution of 2.4 billion euros over the next 10 years to support hybrid capital. U.S. provided 25 billion in guarantees. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about. 35 to 40-year maturities for investments in social and human capital, reducing interest rates in transitional projects, but as he also stressed, financial engineering will not address the IDA replenishment, and that's going to have to be very, very rigorous.
Okay. And also, thank you, Audrey. Yeah, we'll have the responses, and then we do another round of questions. Yeah.
Thanks. No, just some reactions. I think some of the questions were a bit general. I don't think there was anything specifically to what the issues that we raised, but just on the couple of the general questions on the coordination and cooperation, of course, our role, we are not a financial institution, so we're not lending or deciding anything in that sense. Our role is on the analysis of the interface of debt and development particularly. And I know, for instance, in sense of the intergovernmental track that in Geneva is particularly at the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Financing for Development that was taking place this week in Geneva. There was actually very strong participation from the IFIs, and there was a panel, particularly on debt swaps. I think it's one of the issues that Colombia raised. The report of the panel will be coming out shortly, and actually the closing session should be starting about now in Geneva. There's agreed policy recommendations, that's consensus language from member states. So we can share that, of course, as a contribution. That's an ongoing process, and we do take on board the analysis of all the parties, a multi-stakeholder discussion. And in terms of the specific issues that I think member states are looking for the IATF to focus on, I think those are issues that we have taken note of, so I'll make sure that my technical colleagues have that information so that they can give the relevant inputs to the IATF, and we'll be glad to take that forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have time for a second round of questions. We have Portugal in the room. Then I'll just, on the screen, Stefano, maybe as coordinator of the CSO mechanism, you can go next, and then we'll call on additional questions. But first, Portugal, please.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you for all the members of the ITF for this briefing, which is all appreciated. Just first of all, a word of appreciation and a word of encouragement. Appreciation for the work that you're doing, which has been mandated by member states, and its usefulness as a former co-facilitator of the negotiations on the outcome document of the Financing for Development Forum. I found that to be very useful and valuable, given the widespread range of actors that are involved, but also the fact that it's a consensus document. And while it's not the only input that informs that process, it is a valued input. And the second, which is a word of encouragement to continue that work, because not only will this work inform the following FFD forum, but it will also be taken into consideration as member states, move step by step closer to the fourth conference on financing for development, and other processes that also relate to financing for development issues, such as the Summit of the Future that tackles with IFA reform and go beyond GDP, for example. So. Those are the only two notes that I wanted to underline, and also when thinking forward to and even though you're in respect of consensus, to try to be as positive and forward-looking as possible, because that is what we intend as member states, to move these processes forward and not stagnate. We need innovative solutions in any chapter that the ITF usually encompasses. So thanks again.
Thank Thank you so much, Duarte. Stefano?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. And I'm Stefano Prato, speaking on behalf of the Civil Society Financing for Development mechanism, which, as you know, is the inclusive and official mechanism of engagement with the FFD process for civil society in all its various domains and processes. Let me just contribute with three quick thoughts. Well, the first one I think is it's a word of excitement because it's a very promising phase for financing for development. We are really energized to start preparations for the FFD forum in view of the exciting process and prospects for a UN tax convention and also for FFD4. So we really look forward to the second committee, to the General Assembly deliberations for the confirmation of FFD4 and its modalities. And as FFD mechanism, we already articulating our own roadmap towards FFD4, both globally and regionally. But let me also spend 1 second to say that we really strongly welcome and support the draft resolution on promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation at the UN. We really want to commend the Africa Group for excellent leadership on this issue and call on all governments to support the draft, ensuring that the level of ambition and the key elements of the resolution remain intact in the negotiation, and really hope that all member states would want to work actively to promote its adoption as a matter of highest priority. So we really look forward to a process for the establishment of a member state-led, open-ended, ad hoc intergovernmental committee to elaborate on a comprehensive tax convention. Now, this may sound a little diversion from what we're discussing here, but actually it's not, because it serves as an important preamble to address the role of the Interagency Task Force. Now, it probably doesn't come to a surprise to you that as much as we deeply appreciate the cooperation with the Financing for Sustainable Development Office, we've been extremely critical of the work of the task force because of its internal power asymmetries and political economies. You know very well that our position as civil society is that the core struggle of the FFD process is that of democratizing global economic governance and establish a more democratic governance ecosystem, which is centered around the United Nations. I'm sorry to say that some of the big powers behind the task force are clearly out of sync with this focus and rather stand to defend the institutional status quo. Now, I view the task force to the extent that it deliberate collectively and by consensus is not a progressive instrument in advancing the FFD agenda, but rather one that wants to protect the current institutional ecosystem, including many false solutions that stand as an obstacle for systemic reforms. It is really distressing to hear the IMF saying that we are not into a systemic debt crisis, simply because of the definition of what is systemic, intended as its capacity to propagate within the financial system. And I think it contrasts deeply with the implication of the current situation of debt distress in the reality of people and communities in the countries concerned. So when we're discussing the international financial architecture, there is an obvious conflict of interest in having the Interagency Task Force lead the work, because when we're discussing the architecture, we're discussing the role, mandates of the institutions that are part of the task force themselves. You know? So as we engage in an active phase of negotiations, we really need to change gear with the primacy of the task force and its report in the lead up to the forum, as this is not the architecture that we want to replicate in preparing for financing for development forum. Rather, the task force should be on the receiving end of the FFD deliberations, rather than at the core of its preparations. We believe the leadership and primacy should be in the direct hands of member states. And that takes me to the last comment, which is on the proposal on the current report. Well, you know, the proposal in terms of focus and approach probably goes in the right direction, you know, in terms of refocusing the task force on assessing progress on a longer time horizon. However, we really want to stress that we do not welcome recommendations from the task force, particularly when they need to be agreed by all members of the task force. This has limited proposition to what is agreeable within the internal consensus. And again, this plays in with the unhelpful political economy and power asymmetries within the task force itself. And the report should therefore inform, but not frame, the political dialogue and decision making. We're fine in having, a good assessment of progress, but that's where the report should end. And the current progress on tax, which is energizing us all, exposes the limits of the task force. This is something that the task force would have never been able to propose. And in fact, it has not been able to really be a proactive force. It is only when the matter was taken firmly in the hands of member states, thanks to the leadership of the Africa Group, that the progress has eventually moved forward. We therefore encourage member states to take this reality into consideration when planning the FFD4 preparatory process in its various steps and its various roles. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano. We have a few more requests from the floor. If I could, we'll call on you. If I could ask you to be very brief, 1 minute each, because we'll need some time to respond to the comments. So we can first go to Nicholas. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Apologies. George Florin Cycle. 1 minute, please. Thank you. Oh, okay. We cannot hear you. You are muted, George.
Hear me now.
No, we can't hear you. Maybe while you try to fix your microphone, we have one more colleague in the room. Please, 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Well, I'm Luis from Thailand. Well, just to give you a brief thing, I think I'm very encouraging this time because the update of the report would have the 20-year analysis, and then I'm so looking forward to, because last year as we really used the report to frame when we try to negotiate the outcome of the FFD forum, and then the next year would be quite critical if there would be the potential conference, and that there will be a lot of preparation, and I think this would be a good input. But I'm very curious on a couple of issues that I look forward. There is no pressure on this, but just look forward to see how the reform of IFI or IFA would be reflected in this report, because in consideration of this 20-year looking ahead, it is quite interesting to see how the IATF would come up with a recommendation. And then and the second thing is that there is some focus on DMR, domestic mobilization resources. This is quite interesting as well to see how the report would come up with the recommendation, because considering what is going on right now with the resolution that many colleagues have gone to attend, I think the tax cooperation has a lot to do with the DMR, and there are some pullback. I mean, as a country, Thailand doesn't really have. We are quite flexible on whatever would come, but we are quite following this very closely, and it would be interesting to see really in this report how this would turn out. And the one last thing is that to give you a word of encouragement, the report that has been released so far, I think this is very comprehensive, and keep on doing this good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Anita?
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much. I'm Anita Thomas. I chair the NGO Committee on Financing for Development. Just taking a look at the outline, we are very encouraged by it in the sense that as NGOs advocating on FFD from a holistic perspective, how financing for development translates to the ground for people and the planet. So we are encouraged to see the specific reference to food security, poverty, inequality, and so forth. So thank you for the work that you're doing and really for this briefing. I have a few key recommendations as you are developing the report. In addition to gender lens budgeting, to include gender lens investment, especially progress being made through targeted thematic financial instruments such as orange bonds and blue bonds. We see it being talked about extensively, but we don't see feedback on as to how much of credible impact these are making. So it'll be helpful to see that, as well as with regard to inclusive finance, and not only access to financial services, but designing financial products with the consumer in mind, especially MSMEs, women, migrants, and also investment in digital identity programs and interoperable payment systems. Gender disaggregated data is very important. I saw that mentioned, but it's very specific to financial inclusion, and as well as financial literacy and numerous skills and lack of digital tools and internet connections. There is a reference to central bank digital currencies. 130 governments are exploring central bank digital currencies, specifically also being raised as a tool for advancing financial inclusion. But here it's not. It'll be great if it could be brought in the financial inclusion aspect, because and to hear what progress is being made. Future of work, they were, the ILO Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection, investments in the 12 high impact initiative that came through the SDG Summit would be valuable, because these are tools for advancing the advancing sustainable development goals. And I'll stop there. I have several more, but we can submit a written response. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you so much. Yes, and please, we have to conclude this part of the discussion, so we have a few minutes to respond. So apologies to those we couldn't give the floor to. Please send us your reflections, comments, especially the detailed ones in writing, so we can take a careful look at them and make sure some of this is reflected. So, final round of responses from our side. Just from my side, Stefano, maybe one quick reflection on this. I agree with you that this is a member state-led process. We are indeed in their hands. That also means for us, of course, to fulfill the mandates they have given us, to work as a task force and preparing this report specifically, as we had mentioned, in providing a contribution to preparations for a conference. And as you said, it's not, as others have said, it's not the only one, but we do think there's value in the system providing a shared contribution to this process. Colleagues, if you have any other reflections or final responses.
Maybe I'll just follow up on what Oliver said. So there's also, just to note that there's also an incredible value to all of us talking to each other more, that I think that has been very, very helpful in terms of, even when there are disagreements, to have those conversations and discuss them and really understand and delineate exactly where the disagreements are, to be able to figure out how to bring those together is a really valuable process, just to add. But as Oliver said, this is not meant to be a political report. It's meant to be a technical report. We've even always taken the requests from member states for recommendations as technical recommendations, not as political recommendations. And the political side happens elsewhere. The Secretary General put forward a very bold IFA policy brief to put forward his own views on where he thinks that has to happen, that I'm sure our colleagues would not have necessarily signed on to, but that's, and in this year's report, there will be questions of where do we go on IFA and other questions, and in many cases, we will pose them as questions probably. So we will be informative and actual, and highlight, we can put in boxes where things are happening, what those discussions are politically, and we can put forward questions for some of to be considered by member states going forward at a conference. So, but just to note that, the report is one piece, and it's a piece that I think we all find very, very valuable, and I hope member states do as well. And it's not going to be we try to keep it as apolitical as we can, but we all coming from the different perspectives of all of the contributors, and then it goes to the political process. Thanks.
Thank you, Shari. Any other reflections from the podium? I don't know if we have still colleagues on I think George had to leave. Yeah, so if there are none, then thank you so much, everyone. As I said, please, if you have more detailed reflections, share them with us. This is the perfect moment for us to get them, as we are starting to really do the work. And just an announcement, we plan to have more engagements like this. There'll be different opportunities. At the minimum, we'll do one more dialogue in January where we'll be much closer to the finishing line, and so we'll have more of the substantive messaging already to report. But there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to engage with the task force and all of us as you work on the FFD agenda in the coming months. Thank you so much.